There is a moment in life when the silence gets so loud that it finally tells you the truth. And before we go any further, pause for just a second and tell me where you're listening from, because stories like this have a way of finding people who need them most. My name is Alina Whitmore. I am 63 years old, born and raised in Ohio, and for most of my life I believed that loyalty, patience, and sacrifice would eventually be returned in equal measure. I was wrong. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy, and I'm not telling it because I enjoy reliving what happened. I'm telling it because this is the moment everything changed. The moment I realized that the people closest to you don't always betray you with cruelty. Sometimes they do it with paperwork, polite smiles, and signatures written in ink that costs more than your dignity. On a quiet Tuesday morning, sitting in a law office that smelled faintly of leather chairs and burnt coffee, I watched my own name disappear from a future I had spent 4 decades building. Not because I was careless, not because I was foolish, but because everyone around the table believed the same thing, that an older woman who stayed calm, who didn't raise her voice, who trusted her family, would never fight back. They thought my silence meant weakness. They mistook my restraint for surrender. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that I had already learned the rules of this game long before they tried to erase me. And this story doesn't begin with revenge. It begins with realization, the kind that settles into your bones, straightens your spine, and quietly prepares you to take everything back without asking for permission. What made that morning unbearable wasn't the legal language or the finality of the documents. It was the calm efficiency with which everyone behaved, as if my absence from the conversation had already been agreed upon long before I arrived. My husband sat 2 seats away from me, posture relaxed, hands folded neatly on the table, nodding along as if this were a routine meeting about quarterly projections instead of the quiet dismantling of a life we had built together. The attorney spoke in measured tones, using phrases like streamlining governance, protecting the company's future, and minimizing risk exposure, words that sounded reasonable until you realized I was the risk being removed. I watched the pen move across the paper, signature after signature, each stroke clean and confident, and I understood with painful clarity that this hadn't happened overnight. This was not a spontaneous decision born of necessity. This was a plan, carefully timed, carefully framed, and carefully executed while I was busy being useful instead of watchful. For years, I had stepped back willingly, telling myself it was temporary, that leadership didn't need a spotlight, that my contribution lived in systems rather than titles. I had designed compliance frameworks, negotiated safeguards, and drafted contingency clauses that kept the company solvent during downturns no one else anticipated. Yet there I was, being thanked politely for my historical role, as though my relevance had expired the moment I stopped asserting it. No one raised their voice. No one looked uncomfortable. And that was the most chilling part of all. Betrayal delivered with professionalism doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like erasure. I left the building without saying a word, not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood that words were no longer the currency being traded. Power was, control was, and I had underestimated how quietly those things could be taken when wrapped in courtesy. Outside, the city moved as it always did, traffic humming, people crossing streets with coffee cups and earbuds, lives continuing uninterrupted, while mine had just shifted onto an axis I hadn't chosen. I sat in my car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying the last decade with a new lens. The late nights when I stayed up rewriting contracts so the company wouldn't be exposed. The weekends I skipped family gatherings to prepare compliance audits that saved us millions. The countless moments I was told, "You're better behind the scenes," and believed it was respect rather than positioning. I saw now how often I had been praised right before being sidelined, how frequently my competence had been used as a reason to exclude me from decision-making rather than include me in it. It wasn't that they doubted my ability, it was that my ability made them uncomfortable. Competence without dependence is threatening, especially to people who benefit from your silence. As I drove home, the initial shock began to harden into something steadier, more focused. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't collapsing. I was calculating. Every system I had helped build, every safeguard I had put in place, every contingency clause that required unanimous consent or triggered reviews. I knew them all because I had written most of them myself. And for the first time, instead of feeling guilty for noticing that fact, I allowed myself to feel clear. If they believed removing me from the table meant removing my influence, they had misunderstood the structure entirely. Influence doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It waits, it watches, and when the moment comes, it acts with precision rather than noise. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling normalcy, as if the world expected me to accept what had happened and move on quietly. My husband went to work as usual. Emails from the company arrived, still polite, still cordial, carefully avoiding any mention of my removal, as though acknowledging it might invite resistance. Friends asked how things were going, and I answered with the same practiced calm I had used my entire adult life. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I began to revisit old files late at night, not with bitterness, but with intent. I opened digital archives I hadn't touched in years, rereading clauses I had once insisted on adding, just in case, remembering the arguments I'd had with executives who thought my caution was excessive. Those clauses were still there, dormant but intact, woven into shareholder agreements, compliance frameworks, and governance policies no one bothered to revisit because they assumed stability was permanent. As I worked through them, memory after memory surfaced. Meetings where I'd been the only one asking uncomfortable questions, decisions delayed because I refused to sign without safeguards, crises averted quietly and then forgotten. I realized then that what they had taken from me was visibility, not leverage. And leverage, unlike titles, doesn't disappear simply because someone decides you're inconvenient. It sits patiently, waiting for the right conditions. By the end of that week, I had assembled a private ledger, not of grievances, but of mechanisms. Triggers, dependencies, oversights. I wasn't planning revenge in the way people imagine it, fueled by anger or humiliation. I was preparing alignment, bringing truth back into systems that had grown careless in their arrogance. They believed the story was over because my name was no longer printed on the door. What they didn't understand was that the real story had only just begun. By the second week, the illusion they relied on began to show hairline fractures, not visible enough to alarm them yet, but enough for me to recognize the pressure building beneath the surface. I started making calls that sounded casual on the outside, the kind of conversations people assume are harmless when they don't understand context. An old compliance officer I'd trained years ago, a former board consultant who still owed me a favor he'd never quite repaid. A regulatory analyst who once told me, half-jokingly, that my instincts were the reason the company had survived a federal review without penalties. I never mentioned betrayal. I never mentioned my removal. I asked neutral questions, framed as curiosity about updated reporting structures, revised authorization chains, and whether certain safeguards were still being actively monitored. Each conversation confirmed the same thing. Once I stepped away, corners had been cut. Processes had been simplified. Oversight had been delegated to people who confused speed with competence. That was always the danger. Systems don't fail loudly at first, they drift. And drift is only dangerous when someone understands the original design. At home, my husband grew distant in a way that pretended to be concern. He asked if I was doing okay, suggested maybe I should take a break, travel, rest. The implication was gentle but unmistakable. Step aside gracefully. I smiled, thanked him, and said I was enjoying the quiet. What I didn't say was that quiet is where patterns become visible. Every night, I reviewed another layer of the structure we had built together, dependencies between subsidiaries, reporting thresholds that triggered audits, clauses that required disclosure if altered without unanimous consent. They hadn't removed me from the system. They had simply stopped watching the system altogether. And as I documented each deviation, each unreported adjustment, each assumption made in my absence, I felt something steady take shape. Not anger, not grief, but inevitability. When people believe they've won, they stop being careful. And carelessness in the wrong environment is the most expensive mistake of all. The first real crack came quietly, the way structural failures always do. No explosion, no warning sirens, just a subtle shift that only someone intimate with the architecture would notice. A quarterly disclosure was filed late. Only by 48 hours, barely a blip on anyone's radar, but that delay triggered a cascade I had once designed intentionally, a safeguard meant to force internal review when timelines slipped. This time, no review happened. The automated alert went unanswered. The secondary report, which required a sign-off I used to provide, was rubber-stamped by someone who didn't understand why it existed in the first place. I watched it unfold from a distance, not as an outsider, but as the original architect observing her design being mishandled by people who thought they knew better simply because they now held the titles. That's when I stopped documenting and started preparing. Not for confrontation. Confrontation is emotional and inefficient, but for exposure. I requested copies of public filings under my own name, perfectly legal, perfectly ordinary. I cross-referenced them against internal protocols I had written years earlier, protocols still legally binding despite my removal. The inconsistencies stacked up faster than I expected. Small ones at first, then larger omissions that carried regulatory consequences no one else seemed to recognize. Meanwhile, my husband's confidence grew. He spoke more freely about future plans, about restructuring, about how leaner leadership was already paying off. He mistook my silence for resignation, my calm for acceptance. He didn't see the irony. Everything he was proud of still depended on systems designed to protect against exactly this kind of overconfidence. Late at night, when the house was still and even the hum of the refrigerator sounded intrusive, I reviewed the final clause he had forgotten about, the one requiring disclosure of operational changes to all founding partners, regardless of current position, if those changes altered risk exposure. My name was still there, indelible, untouched, waiting. And for the first time since that meeting, I allowed myself a small, private certainty. This story wasn't moving toward revenge fueled by emotion. It was moving toward consequence. Precise, documented, unavoidable consequence. By the time the consequences began surfacing publicly, the narrative was already out of their control. It started with questions, polite ones at first, from auditors who noticed discrepancies they couldn't reconcile with the company's own risk disclosures. Then came follow-up inquiries, requests for clarification that demanded timelines, signatures, and explanations no one on the current leadership team could fully provide. I watched the shift happen in real time, the way confidence drains from a room when certainty is replaced by doubt. My husband stopped talking about work at dinner. Meetings ran later. Phone calls moved from casual to clipped, his voice tight with irritation. He tried, and failed, to hide. What he didn't know was that none of this required me to raise my voice or step into the spotlight. The systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do when misused: reveal the truth. Each unanswered question amplified the last, exposing not just procedural failure, but the absence of institutional memory. Decisions were being challenged not because someone was vindictive, but because no one left in the room understood why things had been done a certain way in the first place. That's the danger of erasing people instead of listening to them. You don't just lose loyalty, you lose context. And context is what keeps structures standing. I remained outwardly unchanged, still composed, still distant, still unassuming. But inside, I felt something solid settle into place. This wasn't about proving I'd been right. It was about restoring balance. When you remove accountability from systems built on trust, collapse isn't dramatic, it's inevitable. And they were finally beginning to understand that the woman they had dismissed hadn't been a problem to eliminate, but a foundation they could no longer replace. The moment it truly unraveled wasn't loud or public. It was internal, deeply human, and impossible to undo. A senior compliance officer resigned without warning, citing ethical uncertainty in her exit letter. That phrase alone sent tremors through the executive floor. Shortly after, a board member requested an emergency review, not because of what had already been found, but because of what might still be hidden. That's when fear replaced arrogance. Policies were suddenly reread. Old emails resurfaced. Names long absent from conversations, including mine, began appearing again, whispered first, then spoken outright. I wasn't present, but I didn't need to be. I had lived inside those rooms long enough to know the rhythm of panic when people realize they've built their authority on incomplete understanding. My husband came home one night and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. He didn't ask questions. He didn't accuse. He simply said my name softly, the way you do when you finally understand something too late. In that moment, I felt no triumph. What I felt was distance, emotional, irreversible distance. Because when trust fractures at this level, it doesn't shatter, it erodes. Quietly, permanently. He had believed power came from position. I had always known it came from knowledge, patience, and restraint. And now, as the systems corrected themselves and accountability closed in, the truth became unavoidable. Removing me hadn't simplified anything. It had exposed how much of the structure relied on someone they never bothered to fully see. By the time the formal investigation was announced, the narrative had already shifted, and not in the way they expected. What the executives feared most wasn't legal consequence. It was loss of control over the story they had told themselves for years. I watched from a careful distance as statements were drafted, revised, and diluted, each version trying to preserve dignity while conceding just enough fault to appear cooperative. Inside that chaos, my absence became conspicuous. People started asking why the one person who had always balanced precision with discretion was no longer part of the process. Old colleagues reached out quietly, not to apologize, but to understand. They wanted context. They wanted to know what I had seen, what I had warned about, and why I had been so calm when everything started to crack. I answered selectively, never emotionally, never vindictively. I didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight now. Meanwhile, my husband withdrew into himself, his confidence unraveling as he realized the cost of mistaking loyalty for leverage. He began to understand that pushing me aside hadn't made him stronger. It had removed the one person who would have protected him from his own blind spots. Nights grew quieter. Conversations became transactional. The marriage, once built on shared ambition, now existed in parallel lanes with no intention of merging again. And in that stillness, I made a decision not out of anger, but clarity. I would no longer measure my worth by proximity to power or proximity to him. I would define it on my own terms, informed by everything I had endured and everything I now understood. The reckoning wasn't explosive. It was exact, and it was irreversible. The final shift didn't arrive with a confrontation or a dramatic exit. It arrived quietly, the way real endings often do. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter, I realized there was nothing left to wait for. No apology that would restore trust, no explanation that would undo the choices already made. The company would survive in a diminished form, the marriage would dissolve with paperwork instead of promises, and the people who had underestimated me would move on, carrying lessons they learned too late. I packed my life with intention, not haste, choosing what to keep and what to leave behind as an act of authorship over my own future. In the months that followed, I rebuilt deliberately, professionally, financially, and emotionally, leaning on competence rather than validation. Opportunities emerged not because I chased them, but because credibility travels. I spoke when invited, advised when asked, and declined when something didn't align. Peace became the metric of success. Looking back, I didn't win by exposing anyone or taking anything away. I won by refusing to shrink when it was convenient for others. The betrayal had been real, the losses tangible, but so was the strength forged in navigating them. And as I stepped fully into a life shaped by clarity and self-respect, I understood the truest form of revenge isn't spectacle. It's sovereignty. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or quietly erased, then you already understand the power of patience and clarity. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. And for more true-to-life stories of betrayal, resilience, and calculated revenge, subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub. New stories are coming, and trust me, the reckoning has only just begun.